What's up, everybody? This is Andrew Gillum, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Real Talk with Andrew Gillum. We are talking today with some amazing individuals about what happened in Florida. Like many of our panelists, many of us got calls, outreaches after the race, many before the race, just sort of trying to get a diagnosis on what's going on, what's going to happen in Florida. Everyone knows that Florida has traditionally been a pretty much 1% state when it comes to statewide elections. And I will admit, present company included, Florida has not done so well, probably since 2012, in delivering Democratic wins, statewide wins in the state of Florida. And so instead of one, I encourage you to read everything that you can, read everything you can consume, obviously, that's being said about what happened in this race. And this isn't really intended to be a hot wash. There are plenty of organizations, individuals, campaigns who are going to be in the middle of that, but an opportunity to pull back the layers of some of the assumptions that are made about Florida. The beginning one, and it's one that I'm going to fall into the trap but quickly correct myself, because today is intended to be a deeper dive into how Latinos performed in the state of Florida. And here comes the contradiction, which is we say Latino vote, like we say Black vote or woman vote, as if these constituencies are a monolith, and they are not. And as you'll hear from some of our experts, Florida especially has a unique constituency here. And so without further ado, I want to bring to your listening ears some of my friends and experts in the field who are going to help walk us through this conversation. First, I've got Carlos Odio, who is the co-founder and senior VP of Equis Labs, like those Equis, but Equis, which just means X. It's the question. It's the piece to be filled in. It's a polling and research firm specializing in the Latino vote. We have Rosie Gonzalez-Spears, who's the senior advisor to the Florida Democratic Party, former executive director of an organization I helped to found, Forward Florida. We've got Luciana Perez, who is the Florida deputy communications director for the Biden campaign and former FDP comms director. Extremely skilled woman down in South Florida, helping to power this state forward. And of course, last but certainly not least, the man with the perfect hair. Actually, there's a race between he and Carlos. I have none, and it is leaving me by the day. But in addition to the perfect hair, he is principal of the Dixon and Amandi Strategies and the host of Strange Days podcast. And of course, you can download that anywhere you download your respective apps. And so, what's up, everybody on the line? How y'all doing? And I don't mean for you to answer the "how you doing" part because I can't hear you. But wave and say what's up.
Is Joe Biden still the president-elect?
Last time I checked, but you know what? It's still early this Friday. We'll see.
Then I'm doing great in that case.
Good. Well, I want to welcome all of you, but I want to kick off our conversation together, and it really is intended to be a conversation. I'll ask some questions, but I'm hoping that with such brilliant and experienced minds assembled here, that if you all want to dive in on any particular piece or contradict any particular piece, however you want to do it, we are among friends. And I think more than anything, we want to educate ourselves, educate others, and then I think help to, through the unpacking here, maybe provide a path forward, in my case, specifically for how Democrats approach organizing in the state of Florida, especially within the Latino community. So with that, without further ado, I want to invite Carlos with Equis to talk a little bit about, first, the national landscape as it relates to, again, this quote, Latino vote. And I've always tried to preface that we're not talking about a monolith, but the Latino vote. And then I would love, following the national landscape, a little bit of a drill down on what's up in Florida. And then from there, we'll have a couple of follow-ups for you. So with that, Carlos, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, great, Andrew. Thanks for having me on this topic, especially because we've heard a lot about the Latino vote.
Yeah.
I'd say a great portion of it has not been the most well informed or coming from the best place, in part because the data is very early, and so I give that caveat to say we're still trying to glean what happened off of very preliminary evidence. There's still so much to study, especially with a vote that is as complicated as this. But I think to talk about the Latino vote, we actually have to start with talking about the white vote. I mean, the reality is the big picture is that Joe Biden is going to win the presidency in spite of losing the country's majority racial group. He's not going to win a majority of the white vote nationally. In almost all of the key battleground states, he's going to win less than a majority of the white vote, including places like Michigan and Wisconsin. And so he wins. You're only able to win on the strength of non-white voters. The math works for Democrats because you're getting 9 in 10 Black voters and somewhere around 2/3 of Latino voters. Understanding Latino voters, there's also Afro-Latino. So those categories are not perfect. We're shorthanding for the purposes of this conversation. But we saw massive, on the Latino front specifically, we saw massive turnout. Early estimates are that you're going to see 20 million Latino voters. I mean, that's a huge number. Biden won the Latino vote in every state. Despite what you might have heard, there are shifts that we're going to talk about here, but Biden wins Latino vote in all states. And so we're going to take a quick tour here through a couple of these to then move in on Florida, because I think it gives a good context for where we are. Arizona, we just got it called finally last night, as we thought it would. And it's such a great story that, Andrew, you know so well, right? SB 1070 happens 10 years ago, worst anti-immigrant legislation in the country at that point. And what came out of it was this organic, incredible organizing infrastructure led by immigrant youth in the state, and organized over the last decade, built to wins. They defeated the author of that bill. They defeated the terrible Sheriff Joe Arpaio. And these wins built momentum to the point where Arizona could be even talked about as a battleground state. And so at the end of the day, you get these sort of swing white voters, the Cindy McCain, Jeff Flake kind of voters, but they're only building on the success that was created by this incredible Latino infrastructure. If the estimates today hold, I think we will have seen the Latino vote double since the Obama election, which is just massive increase. And I have to say, as in many places, these surges are on the backs of Latina, right? It is in the early vote, 55% of the Latinos voting early were Latinas, outstripping their representation. So, which is incredible, and is a story that we see across all these states. You move over to Nevada. When we looked at our simulations in Nevada, everyone was calling Nevada a safe state. We were worried about Nevada. We said Nevada could be the Michigan of 2020. There are way too many variables involved, especially with the way the state was hit by COVID. And because of the unpredictability of the white vote in a state like that. If the white vote stayed where it was, we were going to be fine. If it dropped at all, it could get dicey. And sure enough, the state got very, very tight. Biden will have won Nevada by less than Arizona, even though Nevada was considered safe blue under many prognosis. And it is, when you look at election day, 25% of the vote on election day was Latinos. Usually Latinos are somewhere in the teens as a percent of the vote. And it's 25% of the people who show up on election day are Latino. And so the cavalry showed up. And so Latinos helped save the day in a place like Nevada. But we can't just talk about these very, very heavily Latino states. If you look at Wisconsin, if you look at Michigan, if you look at Georgia, it is small populations, but that, in partnership with other voting groups, help make a win possible. Pennsylvania, I think, is such an incredible example of that. Similarly, our simulation showed if the polling for the white vote held up, Biden was just going to run away with the state. But if it were to drop by a similar proportion to what we saw in 2016, then it was going to get very, very tight. And sure enough, it dropped, and the polling error was similar to what we had seen in 16. And what we had said in that scenario is the Latino vote would become incredibly pivotal, small but pivotal, and we would have to maintain very high support in order to make the math work. And sure enough, I think that's actually the state where, at this point, we're seeing the highest Latino support, which is notable as well because it's a heavily Puerto Rican Latino vote in Pennsylvania, but a different partisan breakdown in this election than we saw in Central Florida. And so even within, you say Latinos aren't a monolith, even within subgroups, the Puerto Rican vote is not a monolith. And the Puerto Rican vote in a place like Pennsylvania, different from the one in a place like Orlando. So that's the good news. We had a coalition of the fed up that helped Joe Biden get elected. But I think there are questions and concerns that arise out of this election. There was sort of across the board Trump making small gains among Latino vote. I think that we've heard a lot about this. It was smaller than I think people might make it seem, but it was notable in an election where other voters were moving away from Trump, that you had Latino voters by a few points in most places, Trump improving on his 2016 margins. And actually, we saw improvement over 2012 margins, and in some places, improvement over 2008 margins. And so there is something there, and it's worth studying because going forward, the Democratic coalition is going to have to look different. And so you're just seeing the electoral map. We're gonna take a detour to South Texas, and then we're going to go to Florida, because South Texas is an important story. The Rio Grande Valley overall is actually not a huge number of votes. In fact, if Biden had gotten the same margins in South Texas that Hillary Clinton had gotten, he still is going to lose the state of Texas by 500,000 votes. To win Texas, he was going to have to match or exceed Beto O'Rourke's white support, and he didn't. And that's actually the bigger story in Texas. Latino vote made the state a battleground to begin with. And there was, though, underperformance, and I think it's worth studying for going forward. This is the 4 major counties that look at Rio, that make up the valley, the RGV. And you see, relative to 2008, every cycle, a drop in the Democratic margin that is pretty significant, down to where we saw in this election. But the real story, when you drill down, if you look at the total ballots cast, so we're not looking as a percent of the vote, you look at the total number of people who voted for the Democrat in these elections or for the Republican. In this election, it's not that the Democrat, Joe Biden, gets fewer votes than past Democrats. He actually gets more. There's a surge in turnout that benefits him. What you see is a huge surge in Republican votes, in Trump votes, that Trump is somehow able to pull out more conservative Hispanics who normally weren't voting. It's actually similar to the dynamic that we saw among non-college white voters in 2016, but from which Latinos had been mostly insulated. It seemed like in this election, there was that insulation, that wall had come down, and some of that effect was now spilling over into more conservative Hispanic communities. That is all a setup to get to Florida, where the story has some of those elements, but is otherwise very different. Here's just Hidalgo County, which is the biggest of the ones in the valley, and you can see the real huge jump in Trump votes. Incredibly significant. But the Florida setup, again, I want to start by saying we cannot blame the Hispanic vote for the result in Florida. I just want to be very clear about this. First of all, Biden wins the Latino vote by a margin statewide that we think is in line with where the polling was. The Miami-Dade wipeout was significant. I don't want to paper that over. This is if you compare the Biden margins relative to Clinton's, Biden underperforms the raw vote margins in 54 of Florida's 67 counties. Now, in terms of the total share of the underperformance, most of that comes from Miami-Dade. But it's a mistake to say the entirety of it does. In fact, that if Biden had gotten the same margin as Clinton in Miami-Dade, he still wins the state of Florida fairly handily, because there was underperformance across the state in very different areas that are worthy of more study. In the few counties where he overperforms are actually more populous counties. Building, Andrew, on the success that you had in Duval, these are more diverse and changing counties. And so, again, Florida always eludes simple narratives. There's no one simple narrative for what happened in Florida. This wasn't just about non-white populations underperforming. It was probably a much more complicated story that we'll only know more about as more data comes back. So it's Miami-Dade time. And this is where you get some more eye-popping numbers, right? As Fernand knows well, and I would love to hear more on his insights from his polling. We saw a heavy shift in the Cuban vote. When we polled in November of 2019, we were alarmed to see the extent to which certain subgroups of the Cuban vote that had been progressive in the past, specifically more recently arrived Cubans who had arrived post-1995, tend to be more working class, had tended to be more progressive, were shifting their vote tremendously. And I think what we'll find is a lot of this vote was already baked in over a year ago, and COVID was not able to shake it. And so we see this is in this graph, you're seeing a comparison of Biden versus Clinton in precincts, depending on how Cuban they are. And the underperformance of Biden is actually across the board in all the Miami-Dade precincts. But as they get more Cuban, you see it widening more. At the end, I think Biden is likely in the low 30s among Cubans in Miami-Dade in 2020. Clinton was in the 40s. She was probably around 44% of the vote. That's a huge swing. You're talking double-digit swing in the vote. If we narrow in on Hialeah, because Hialeah to me is always so fascinating, the rest of the country likes to say, well, the Cubans, it's just, the Coral Gables Cubans who are wealthier, better educated, whatnot. Hialeah is more working class, is more recently arrived, folks who are closer to the immigrant experience, who are more economically sensitive, and where there has been more swing. You saw Democrats like Clinton and Obama actually do fairly well in Hialeah that boosted their margins overall. Andrew, you were at 39% of the vote in Hialeah. Joe Biden is at 33%. That is a low point in this modern era, and I think it's important to try to understand why. What we saw in South Texas was this surge in Trump votes. There's some element of that, but differently here, you're actually also seeing people who had been voting for Clinton now turning around and voting for Donald Trump. People who had been Democrats actually switching their allegiance, and it's a combination of both those factors that creates the final margins that we saw in Miami-Dade. But the Cubans actually aren't the real story as much as we want to talk about it. The real story is the broader Latin American vote, the non-Cuban, non-Puerto Rican vote, of which Colombians are the biggest group, not Venezuelans, despite the amount of attention spent there. Sorry, Usana. It is the Colombians, Nicaraguans, Venezuelans anchoring this vote, but there's also the huge Mexican-American vote, Dominican vote, which still tend to be more Democratic. But among this broader group in Miami-Dade, again, these are, as a precinct becomes more heavily Latin American specifically, you are seeing narrower margins for Joe Biden. In fact, he ends up getting 50% of the Latin American vote. Bill Nelson and Andrew Gillum were around 60% of the Latin American vote. Hillary Clinton got around 70% of the Latin American vote. So you're going from 70 to 50% among these voters. In fact, I think that at the end of the day means that Trump gets more new votes out of the Latin American bloc than he gets out of the Cuban bloc compared to 2016. And here, this is comparing the Cuban precincts, Latin American precincts, and you see that the LATAM underperformance is so much more drastic. And I'll close by saying, though, I think it would be a mistake as we analyze Florida to just think that there was a shift in Miami-Dade. Miami-Dade was much more egregious. I think the reasons why are worthy of discussion, especially as Rick Scott is now head of the NRSC. Marco Rubio is off messing around in Georgia. They're trying to export the Miami-Dade model to the rest of the country. And so I think we have to understand what they did in Miami. But it wasn't just Miami, it was Orlando. Among Puerto Ricans, despite everything we'd seen in the press, despite all the paper towel news and the hurricane, Donald Trump actually improved on his 2016 margins among Puerto Ricans. He did better among Puerto Ricans.
4 points.
He did better.
4 points, I believe, in
exactly.
Central Florida.
He did better than better than Rick Scott had. And Rick Scott had done very well. Rick Scott does better than DeSantis in Puerto Rican precincts. And that's an important story. I think the Puerto Rican growth was such that actually Joe Biden netted more votes than Hillary Clinton among Puerto Ricans because the pie grew more. It's just that Biden's share of it was a little bit smaller than Hillary Clinton's. But that's an important story because I think it defies, again, some of the easy characterizations we might make of a vote like the Puerto Rican vote and of many progressives' hopes for silver bullets in a place like Florida. There are no silver bullets in the state of Florida.
Yeah, Carlos, I appreciate that. And the only other thing I would add to the why this topic, particularly the Latino piece, is really important in Florida, as you already pointed out, amongst emerging Latin American demographics in the state of Florida, which I don't see those trends going backwards or going down amongst Nicaraguans, Venezuelans, even though a smaller part of that number, a growing part. That's why you saw Vice President Pence speaking so directly to that community so many times since, going back 2 years. And frankly, through the administration and some of their public policy statements and announcements that were done here in the state of Florida, they targeted those Latin American countries very strategically because, as you know, in Florida, as all of us know, we're a 1% state. We're not talking about moving wholesale constituencies from one corner to the next. We're talking about just gaining enough in a place where when the numbers are all add up, you got one more vote than the next person. But your comment about what Rubio and Scott and others are doing to export what they have seen in South Florida to some of the other states that are seeing rising Latin American and also Latino vote share in those states, it's important for Florida and for Democrats in Florida because we've been saying demography is destiny for us, that the browning of the state of Florida and largely of the United States is going to immediately contribute to more, frankly, Democratic, more liberal voters. And you pointed out in your conversation, and I appreciate it, the gains experienced by Puerto Ricans in Central Florida, 4 points over his 2016 performance. Still, Joe Biden ran away with Puerto Ricans, no doubt about it. But we're not talking. The running away is not necessarily the thing here. Is what you lose and what we need to be growing on, and the trend lines what they're suggesting. You are right to point out that the loss of the Biden campaign was not just about the Latino vote. We saw elderly voters, senior white voters. We saw white men, white women. And he even made some gains, much smaller, amongst some of the African American community. And I'm worried, having looked at what was done in 2012 to 2016 to 2018 to where the Senate race in 18 and the governor's race in 18 were all below a 0.5% difference, and now you got a 4-point spread in a statewide race in the state of Florida. Hugely problematic, and in such a small period of time. I want to know, before we go into some of the pinpointing some of the folly or where we may have been less successful here in this state as it relates to building on some of the gains that we've experienced. I want to get a little bit of a setup, and I don't have a Republican here to open up their manual for us. But all of us know, if we've been paying any attention in the state of Florida for the last several years, and I would say probably going back to Jeb Bush, but there was some nuance attributes for him. So let's go to Rick Scott. Moving forward, what have Republicans been doing in the state of Florida that have positioned them so well, frankly, amongst the entire diaspora of the Latin American constituency? I'm remembering back to running for governor and being in Orlando for the Latino straw poll and the general election. And the only 2 statewide candidates there were me, well, 3. It was me, Nelson, and Governor Scott. And at the end of the night, and you got all this Latino press, radio, television, all over the room, and a bunch of vendors in this space. And at the end of the night, I won the straw poll for the governor's race, and Rick Scott outperformed me and did better and won the straw poll over Nelson for that evening. Again, small microcosm, but wasn't what I was necessarily expecting. 7 trips to Puerto Rico. There's a lot there. But what has been done? What have we been observing happening here? And all of you have an answer here. So go for it. Who wants to go first? Actually, Fernand, why don't you're in Miami. You're our homeboy down there. why don't you kick up and tell me what we've been observing, not just in this cycle, but dialing back a bit as to what led to the advantage I think they've been building.
Well, first and foremost, just let's drill down into Florida a little bit. The secret to winning Florida, it's not really a secret, but for whatever reason, the Democrats just don't want to abide by the lesson. And it's about managing the margins of the different voter groups that make up the state. As we know, Florida is not really one homogenous place like some other states of the country. And I remember waking up the morning after the 2004 election where George W. Bush decisively defeated John Kerry. There was a massive effort here in Florida, but a lot of people, I think, acknowledged that the Kerry campaign at the time was just too little too late, didn't do the kind of work in a systematic kind of permanent campaign mode that the Bush campaign had been doing, really going back to 2000 and even 1999. Yet immediately thereafter, there was a recognition that there was an opportunity 4 years later to start to try and do the work that the Republicans had been doing in managing the margins, engaging a little bit earlier, understanding the different segments of the electorate, and chipping away at those models. We had the good fortune of working on the Obama campaigns in 2008 and 2012, the only two successful presidential campaigns in the state of Florida. And what we did there was very much what I think, for whatever reason, has not only not been replicated by the Democrats in Florida, but which the Republicans, if anything, have followed, which is to start very early, understand that this is not the sort of thing where we can parachute in 3-4 months before the elections, throw a bunch of money at the end, hope some of it sticks, and have that compete with a systematic permanent campaign effort that the Republicans have been doing all of these years. For whatever reason, we just have not done that. And, it's always uncomfortable for me as a pollster who's been polling this state, different parts of the country for the better part of 20 years, to see 3 or 4 months before an election and have to raise my hand and be like, hey, fellow Democrats, we have a problem. We certainly saw it, unfortunately, in your contest in 2018, Mayor Gillum, also for Senator Nelson. And we again saw it here now in 2020. But what the Republicans have done, if you were to ask them to go into their playbook, and I'm sure they'll tell you, they basically freaked the hell out when Obama won in 2008, 2012, especially the 12 campaign. Because what we did in 2012 is we scored the type of numbers with the Hispanic vote here in the state that had never been seen before. We got about 77% of the Puerto Rican vote. We got 70% of the Nicaraguan vote, which was a complete reversal of fortune of what they had been voting. It had always been a more conservative vote. We got over 70% of the Venezuelan vote. Again, another complete reversal of fortune of what had been seen before. The Colombian vote was also nearing that 80 percentile. And to the shock of a lot of people, we managed to get about 49% of the vote of the Cuban American cohort, which was always seen as like, the untouchable group. Obama is able to hold on to the state in spite of the fact that he did much worse with white voters, right? Much worse with white voters. By the way, Democrats never win white voters. At the national level, the Democrats haven't carried the white vote since 1964 in the Johnson landslide over Barry Goldwater. So this idea that we're going to get white voters, it just hasn't happened. We've been successful without doing it. But the way we have to do it, as I think Carlos pointed out earlier, is that non-white vote, we have to maximize those numbers, and we just simply cannot afford to have the recesses there. But the Republicans, very adroitly, what they've done in Florida is they have been full-time permanent campaign. For you sports fans, and I know you're one, Mayor Gillum, I'll never forget watching the World Cup in 2018 and just see Rick Scott commercials and Ron DeSantis commercials and every commercial break thinking, where the heck are we? And it's those little details, that type of groundwork, the engagement that you described that they have done, and we've unfortunately taken our foot off the accelerator. And that's what explains these marginal differences that help them carry the state in something like 26 out of 35 statewide contests since the year 2000.
That's fair. Luisana, you've had the experience of having to watch this playbook on the Republican side. And I know we've got a lot to say about what Democrats have been doing in that period of time. But what other observations have you made around their, what feels like, permanent presence of a campaign apparatus in and outside of these cycles? What else have you picked up there?
You mentioned that in 2018, Rick Scott made 7 trips to Puerto Rico, the same way Rick Scott did several trips to Doral and sit down with Venezuelans. But I think in terms of the messaging, which is like what I know like the most because of my background, it's just interesting to see how the playbook for the Republicans have been to play to the fear, like create that fear in our communities that like, I think there is a very important saying in Spanish that said, it's better the bad people that we know than the good people that we don't. And I think that's what they are playing right now, that they are using the fear of our communities to say, listen, you don't know this new person, you don't know who he is, and he's going to bring all the things that you left behind. And I think that's the playbook, like the fear inspired in our communities that has been moving Venezuelans, Cubans. And I know that Venezuelans are not a large group, as Carlos said, but the issue of Venezuela, it's something that moves around all the communities, whether you're Nicaraguan, you're Colombian, because you're in the region and you're seeing what's happening in Venezuela and you're scared that that comes to your country or to your community. So for the Republicans, I think that has been like the winning point, is to like keep inciting fear in the community. We saw it with the misleading and the disinformation campaign that was running across Miami-Dade, that we were trying to defeat it. We were trying to be out there, but you are dealing with a monster that is moving across WhatsApp, that is moving across Facebook, that is going on Spanish radio every day. And that makes a difference. Like our communities, when they're in fear, they like just try to go for the safe player, for the strong man. And that's something that we saw this year. We saw it in 2018. I think Andrew, your race, and also Senator Nelson was like the experiment, and they saw it there, and they fully implemented this year. And we saw it this week when Marco Rubio said that in 2022 he's going to run against socialism. They're going to use the same tactic. It's something that is just running, and they're going to continue using it.
Yeah, listen, we're gonna dive a little deeper on the messaging piece here. Tactically, Rosie, and your time here in this state, observations around what the Republican playbook has been here in Florida.
Yeah, I think they are extremely disciplined. As Luisana said, is the fear tactic, but they've picked one positive message, and that's the economy and jobs. And they really stick to that. It is, you came to this country to prosper, and we are the party that's going to help you prosper when you work hard. And then they pivot to all of the fear and all of the negativity and the socialism argument and the law and order argument and all of these things that that quite frankly, a lot of Latinos are experiencing and seeing, or they think that they are. And so that is really what we're up against, right? The Democratic Party is the big tent party. We're the party of affordable health care and equity and, good education. And we can go on and on and on as to all the issues that we campaign on. And that is a lot harder than, we're going to get you good jobs and these people are trying to steal your money. And it is really that simple. And what I saw in Florida and what I listened to on Spanish radio and Spanish TV is that they stick to that same message over and over again. Also, I know we're going to go into the socialism question, but, some national Democrats, as amazing as they are, and as a lot of us do agree with them and what they're trying to do, they hand things over on a silver platter to Republicans in Florida. Some of these slogans don't work.
You're not trying to name check anybody here, are you? You just going to say broadly some of our...
I know, just broadly, because look, I'm a Northeast Democrat. I get it. I'm from New York, but working in Florida this cycle, when you're on the ground, you see it is very different, and you need to be able to meet people where they are and meet voters where they are. And you cannot start with, when you hear Democrats say Democrat is socialism, it's different than your socialism, and this is why. That does not work, right? that is a losing battle. And so I think, Republicans in Florida are extremely disciplined. They stick to their message that they know works. And also, they let Democrats self-implode. They watch as the infighting, and not even the infighting, the public fighting takes place. And oftentimes, while they're off building a long-term plan, you see what happened before your race, right before 2018. The Democratic Party completely dismantled, started from scratch in March of 2018, right before, the fall of 2018. Now they're going to do it again. They're going to completely clean house, dismantle, and think they're going to win in 2022. That is not a sustained plan, a sustained investment in the year-round organizing like the Republicans do in Florida.
The only thing, I think all of you made really good observations of what they've been doing, and I just have a few to add. One, this is in part the consequence of what it means to be in a state that has been governed for 2 decades by one party. It gives you, the governor's perch gives you the opportunity to raise money into a party and gobs of it, that you can really run these round-the-clock operations. And in Scott's case, who really dug deeper into the Latino, into the Puerto Rican community, was able to fund himself operations that allowed him to have a more round-the-clock presence. I would also mention the Libre initiative, which has the terminology around that has a national recognition, but the way that I saw it show up in Central Florida, particularly after the hurricane in Puerto Rico, was you were going into these centers where you saw nonprofits or NGO, non-governmental organizations that were not talking political shop with Puerto Ricans off jump. It was, how do we get you connected to housing? How do we make sure we get you connected to, that food resource that you need for your family, or to medical? And it looked like an NGO, and you had religious groups associated with it, but many of these religious groups were organized and in sync in very grassroots ways with the Libre initiative, which I don't want to say co-opted, but certainly very strategically joined with evangelical Puerto Rican congregations, churches that I ran into when I was trying to just visit a church as a candidate, visit some of these communities there, and hit a roadblock, and only behind the scenes was told what was really going on there. So you're not talking to people about public policy per se off jump. You're just meeting them at their need. You're just meeting them at the place where they say they need additional support. Add to that this particular campaign where you had Trump making multiple visits to the state of Florida in strategic locations, in Doral, talking to Venezuelans, even though the man himself, who had the power to extend temporary protective status to Venezuelans, would not do it, deported Venezuelans from the state of Florida and from the country at record rates. None of that mattered because he sent a tweet out of the first lady to the opposition leader in Venezuela, which basically shocked the Venezuelan community and said, man, he sees us. And then you saw the same thing with the Nicaraguan community. And what struck me is that as much as socialism came up, and we're going to this point, as much as socialism came up, it was interesting to me that it is individuals from these countries, these Latin American countries, who have firsthand knowledge, experience of the typograph of these cortijos, yet Trump is much more similarly situated in temperament and otherwise to those individuals than Joe Biden or anybody on the Democratic side. Yet somehow the message of socialism stuck to us and it doesn't stick to them. You've done some polling on this. You've done messaging on this, Fernand. I almost hesitate to ask because it means we're playing on their turf, but we are playing on their turf when it comes to this socialism question. What are Democrats supposed to be saying in response to it? Why is it so resonant in spite of the strong man that Trump presents as? that somehow the Democrats are the ones that get to stick that, that the label sticks, and we have to somehow respond to. What is the advice from a communication standpoint around what we're supposed to be saying here?
I mean, again, the idea that the Republicans are going to play to the lowest common denominator and do fear-based messages, they've been doing that since 1968, so that's not a new development.
Very true.
The idea that they're going to use disinformation, well, if we were integrated as a party into the monitoring of Spanish language media and some of the outlets where they're doing this, and had been in that years ago, we would have found out the day that those efforts happened and could have answered them at that point. The problem is we didn't really come up to that until about 6-7 months after the fact, because those efforts were happening. Some of us, I think everybody on this call knew what was happening, but institutionally as a party, there was not acknowledgement of it. And as a result, you're late to the game. The cardinal sin that was done was to allow the other side, in this case, the Trump campaign and the Republicans, to define the Democrats as the party of communism and socialism. And inexplicably, absurdly, a lot of Democrats thought that it was wrong to even answer that. Oh, we don't want to play on that level playing field. We don't even want to dignify the ridiculousness of that response. We don't want to address the fact. When, for a lot of Hispanics, if you do not answer a charge, you know what they think? Oh, yeah.
It applies.
Which means that's because they think that way, right? I didn't understand the philosophy at all because, I mean, candidly, Mayor Gillum, when I wish I was Governor Gillum, the reason you're not Governor Gillum is because they used that playbook against you.
Very effectively, yes.
The Hispanic community was weaponized around this issue of socialism and communism. And now, before it was just you, now it's for the party. Yeah. So when we rebrand as a party, all of the organizational work, putting more assets on the ground, all you're doing is promoting a party that is seen as the party of communism and socialism. We have to go back to basics and redefine ourselves to give the voters a sense this is not what the party is. And I think it's, as one of the people mentioned, it's the party that is trying to improve people's lives. But politics is like sports. If you build up a lead, then you got to play comeback. You're behind the 8 ball. That's where we found ourselves in this very problematic position here at the end. And we were playing catch up the entire time, unfortunately.
So then, but from a messaging standpoint, and Luciana, step in here as well, because I know you went from the party side directly into the campaign. So they call us socialists. Do we stand up and say, I'm not a socialist? Do you say, because I said I'm not a socialist. That didn't stop them from calling me a socialist. And in this case, I have to tell you, from a public policy standpoint, I fully embrace that I was on a different page than Joe Biden on healthcare, a much more aggressive, quote unquote, universal form of that, which is probably closer to fitting their definition than not. I was, from a policy standpoint, certainly on the progresivo part of this, which I also understand increasingly is not a term that fits well within the Latin American community because it is practically a synonym for socialism, but even still, we perform better. What did we expect for the candidates to say, and would I am not a socialist have been sufficient enough to beat back the claim?
I think the problem is that for Democrats to explain our policy, to explain our messaging takes time. It's always like that. We talk. And for the Republicans, it's just very easy. They say you're a socialist. I don't have to explain you why you are just a socialist. And I think that's how, as Democrats, we need to come together, unify on one messaging and say, we are the party that believes in freedom, the party that believes in opportunities, and show that from top to the bottom. I think that I never thought that I was seeing Joe Biden said 6 times in interviews, I'm not a socialist. This is ridiculous. But it happened. So if we can get to that point where all our electeds can do that and fight that, because in 2019, some of them were fighting the socialism label. We saw Jose Javier Rodriguez fighting the socialism label, but then you see what happened this week. He lost by nothing. So, and it's because he went through all the same wave of the socialist Democrats that are, everybody who has a D next to their names this year was going to suffer a loss. So I think that from a messaging standpoint, it takes us a little longer to say why we're not socialists, but always pivoting to our values, pivoting on why are we the party that is going to help people's lives? Why are we like the party that is going out there improving our education, improving our economy? Why is that? And that's an important point. And continue to say those are lies. I mean, it's very easy. It's a lie. Like I think at some point I heard some Republicans saying, well, it's true, Joe Biden is not a socialist, but Kamala is a socialist. And that's it just continues on being, it's for them, it's just an easy label.
Carlos, I know you all have done, you've got Florida specific polling, but also nationally. I have to imagine calling Joe Biden a socialist in California, or maybe even New Mexico or Colorado, maybe Nevada, I'm not quite sure, but probably not. Is this an attack that is uniquely Florida? Or have you observed in targeting the Latino community around the country that this is something that is resonant? And I also want to just pick your thoughts on what is the most effective way of a response? Because I'm not sure that repeatedly I'm not, or repeatedly I'm not is kind of what we did.
Yeah,
but what's the answer?
Right. Yeah. And when we say I'm not, we're just validating the negative frame. It's don't think of an elephant, right? The socialism attack is not just limited to Florida, and it's not just actually even limited to Latinos. It takes a different tack on it, right? They can't talk about it in terms of cozying up to Venezuela in quite the same way, but it does work. Their approach in a place like Arizona, as in Florida, is the margins game, as Fernand was talking about so well. They're not trying to win the Latino vote. They're trying to shave off a few points here and there, which combined with their coalition of working class white voters could be enough to get them over the finish line. And so they do use it, and it does work. I think that's part of what we saw in places like South Texas. That's what we saw, especially with younger men. There's this young men issue that we're having across race, which is this belief in wrapping themselves in this idea of American dream and like pulling yourself up by the bootstraps in a very particular form of entrepreneurism that's like represented by the Elon Musks of the world. And socialism is the opposite of that. And that's how they hit it. They say they don't believe in opportunity for you. And I think it's important to understand the socialism attack I think we make the mistake of thinking of it as a policy attack or as one particular thing. We think that it's just an attack on saying, yeah, he's gonna let Maduro stay in power in Venezuela. That's what the attack is. When it's actually multi-pronged, right? It's that he's going to bring elements of it to the United States. It's that he's going to raise your taxes, take away your uncle's business, cancel Goya, and defund the police. It's not just it's not foreign policy, it's economics, it's culture, and it's race. It's all of it that's wrapped up, and they create an identity behind Donald Trump that's against it. And what do we do in response to this very complicated attack? Is we'll say something like, "Well, Joe Biden's going to stand up for human rights in Latin America." That's a different debate. That's not what they're saying. Or we say Donald Trump is a strongman. Well, I hate to break it to us because it's very depressing, but a lot of the folks who move toward Donald Trump like that he's a strongman.
Except they don't like strongmen in Latin American countries who promote socialist agendas and in large part use their strongman personality to accomplish it.
Yeah, it's as has been said about right-wing dictators in Latin America for a long time. He's an SOB, but he's our SOB. It's the idea that the way that you fight off the leftist hordes is with a strongman. That's the Pinochet argument. That was the argument for Somoza in Nicaragua. That was the argument for Batista in Cuba. That was the argument for Trujillo. I mean, on and on and on. It's better an authoritarian that's on our side than a socialist totalitarian on the other side. And so we misunderstand that argument. And so we do, I think what everyone was saying here is right, is that what we have to do is we have to say, what are we for, right? It's not just, I'm not a socialist. Fernand's right. We have to take it on head first, but it means that we can't elude the attack. We actually have to say, what are we for? And some of that can get uncomfortable. Like we have to say, I'm a capitalist. That becomes complicated with parts of the Democratic coalition. But we have to like say it explicitly or people say, so then you're not, right?
Yeah.
And showing up is a big part of this too, I just want to say. I mean, it's easier to be made to look like a boogeyman when you're not actually showing up and showing that you are not this big bad, right? And part of it was because of COVID, we weren't present. And so they were able to have this all stick in a way that in other environments, it just wasn't before. We have an opportunity different now that Biden's in the White House, and you can actually model what it looks like to be a Democrat.
Mayor Gillum,
Yeah. Can I just, okay.
Go.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say to that point that we also need to be unified as a national party. So we can't have the Florida Democratic Party saying one thing and the party over here saying something else and the party over here saying something else when it comes to this issue, because this is extremely important. As Carlos said, this is not about just one policy area. This is about an identity. And it is so important that we take that on in that way. So Mayor Gillum, last year, we published an op-ed that you wrote about socialism. And I remember the conversation when we were going through the drafting of that about whether we were going to, yes, and whether we were going to say that you were a capitalist or not. And I just thought it was ridiculous that we were even having that conversation. But that is, we are to the point where after that was published and you articulated perfectly in that op-ed what the Democratic Party is for, what we stand for, how ridiculous it is that the Republican Party is trying to label us as socialist. However, we got pushback from Democrats when that was published. And, I think that when it comes to there are many prescriptions to policy solutions, and we're not going to agree as Democrats on every single one of them. But again, this is about an identity of a party, and we need to figure out nationally what is the answer to that and do it forcefully and consistently and early. And I think that is the way that we beat this back. If we try to piecemeal this the way we've been doing it to date, it is not going to work, and it hasn't worked.
Well, I think you're right. I remember being in South Florida during the campaign and seeing, this was from my campaign forward, and seeing on some of the Spanish news stations that they had pictures of AOC and Bernie Sanders, and quotes that they had. Look, their issue, where they stand on some of these issues is where they stand. But it was interesting because it was being projected as the Democratic position, even though it happened to be the position of members. So I'm not a member of the Democratic Party, but members of the party, but completely outside of where the mainstream of the majority party was. But that's not how the news down there was covering it. Their response was to pick two members who were one not a Democrat, the other, yes, a Democrat, but our minority position within the party to project a larger party. And again, I'm not attacking where their positions are, simply saying that is how that was used. And Fernanda, I know that you wanted to get in, but I want to also ask you, you may want to delve in on this, but I want to ask you, through your polling, to go into this rumor that is a little Florida-based, but I think I've heard it now from Bustos and the D-Trip-C and some of those folks about how Black Lives Matter and this defund the police effort, tactic, strategy, talking point sort of filtrated into specifically the Latino community in Florida. It impacted a lot of communities, they would claim. I want to know, did you all pick this up anywhere? Was there real resonance to this? Was that resonance equal to what we were experiencing in the socialism attack? Unpack that for us just real quick based off of what you know.
Sure. I mean, the short answer is yes. The Republicans are like the Terminator in the movie, right? Like they're all about winning. So if you see something in their messaging, it's because they have tested it and they know it's lethal, right? So I'm sorry, I don't mean to offend anybody. Defund the police was asinine in terms of a framing of a language construct, right? Yeah. That defund the police, not what was meant behind the idea.
Sure.
Good faith
the philosophy that you want to change systems enough that it's not necessary.
But I mean, this idea that language doesn't matter is asinine. Of course, language matters. And we know that because what did the Republicans immediately do? They weaponized something that in the polling was like, holy shit, look what they just stepped into. And that became the mantra. Mm-hmm. They want to destroy the police. They want to eliminate the police department. And when you're in a position where you're having to explain that defund the police doesn't mean defund the police, even though it sounds like defund the police, you're losing. If I could just kind of use that to get back on a point that you made that I think is so important, I think if something we should try and take away from this. You said, I said as a candidate for governor, I wasn't a socialist 6 times. The problem with you having said that, Mayor Gillum, was that you were already perceived to be in the lens and in the frame of being a socialist. So it's, the mindset of Hispanics, and they tell me this in focus groups, sí, es socialista, me está diciendo que no socialista, which means, oh yeah, the socialist is now going to deny he's not a socialist. That's not how you do it. You have to find trusted members in the community whose credentials are unimpeachable as anti-communist, anti-socialist, and say, hey, wait a minute, address the issue head on. This notion that the Democrats are socialists, I'm not a socialist and I'm voting for the Democrats. This is ridiculous. And that's how you move opinion. So it's not enough, unfortunately, for our candidates to explicitly state that. We have to take it on. I go back again to the 2012 campaign. You may remember Obama had a real problem going into that election with Hispanics around the issue of immigration, right? They thought that he was the deporter in chief. They thought that he had not fulfilled a lot of his promises, which was ridiculous given all the stuff that he had done in that first term. But we first had to make the case to them before we could have the president himself explain what he had done and have others do that. So then they said, all right, now I'm open to listen. If we don't address this head on and we keep pretending like it's just going to magically go away, it will not. And we will keep having, unfortunately, these results like we had last Tuesday in Florida specifically.
So
Mayor, can I get in?
Yeah,
Mayor,
please.
Can I just get in on the defund the police point as the Afro-Latina on the panel?
Yes.
So really when the Black after George Floyd happened and we saw just protests across the country, I started doing a lot of Spanish press. Being an Afro-Latina, the party did some Afro-Latina panels to talk about anti-Blackness in our Latino community, which is something that we do not talk about and often do not address. And I have to tell you, I did many TV interviews where the interviewer was shocked that I was saying that there was anti-Blackness in Latin America and was really pushing me on that issue and was, at times, there were very tense interviews. I think that the defund the police argument, again, the sentiment behind it, which many of us understand and agree with, one, does not translate into Spanish, to Fernandez's point about language mattering, right? You can't translate that sentiment nor those words into Spanish and have it make any sense. And also, you are handing an argument on a silver platter that once again we have to defend. And so there's that piece of it, which is problematic. And then there's also this anti-Blackness, which is a larger conversation issue that we have within the Latin American community. And that is why oftentimes Democrats campaign to Latinos as a minority group, when a lot of Latinos do not see themselves as a minority group. And we have very different experiences. My experience in this country as an Afro-Latina is very different than a white presenting Colombian woman. We have very different issues and very different experiences in this country. So Democrats need to also learn how to campaign and how to message effectively to different members of our community. And we did see a big hit with defund the police. I know that I see the Twitter threads and I see all my progressive friends getting really mad that is being said, but that is the truth of what happened in Florida. That is a piece of it. We cannot ignore that. And also, we need to do a lot of work within our own communities, because the fact that we had to have this conversation about Black Lives Matter and had to explain that to the Latino community is also a problem that us as Latinos need to address and need to confront. That's our inner work that needs to be done.
Well, Rosie, I'm glad you went there, because the question I was going to ask you, Leslie, on some of the messaging piece, I wanted to move the tactics, but I've totally run out of our clock, which is why I'm going to have y'all back. So for Black Lives Matter, for the Black community, we thought, and I think the Democratic Party thought, and probably Joe Biden also thought, that when you remind people of a president who threw paper towels at you as his humanitarian outreach to sheer destruction of your life, your livelihood, when you hear a president refer to Mexicans as cockroaches, rapists, gangsters, gang members, when you hear him refer to Black and brown countries around the world as shithole places, when you see repeated disrespect after disrespect, if not just from him, from the people who are part of his major support base, it is a visceral reaction for Black folks to be like, I can't even hear you on jobs, health, economy, any of these other things, because you don't even respect my humanity. That's my life. That means I have to be worried about my children when they cross the threshold of the door on the way to school. That means I have to be worried about if I get pulled over. It isn't law and justice to keep me safe. It is, am I going to emerge from this innocent situation alive? It is at the base, the root of our humanity. And these insults that came from Donald Trump, which I would also consider to be attacks of a subhuman nature. You are less than I am. But something you said about white presenting around this Latino piece really struck me, because it got me to really realize that many of the folks that are part of what we are talking about don't necessarily associate themselves in any way with the insults and the comments that came from this president, which allowed them to escape the humanity piece of it that is so visceral, I think, for Black folks in this country. And it doesn't matter how much you make, what businesses you own, what degrees you have, what neighborhood you live in. It has no respect for any of that. I wonder whether or not you all have, are there segments then? Is it the Afro-Latino piece that only responds to that as in humanity? And where in the polling did we not pick up that talking about throwing and tossing paper towels and whether or not they respect you was going to be issue number 4 for me and not issue number 1? Why did we precipitate a frame that didn't even land? And if it landed, who did it land with?
I'll touch on one piece of it, because we did poll and did significant focus groups on a question you just addressed, which is something like throwing paper towels. We saw repeatedly in the Puerto Rican research, vast majorities rated Donald Trump very poorly on his handling of Puerto Rico, thought he'd done a terrible job in response to the hurricane, thought he had disrespected the community. It was very much there. But when you ask people, what issue are you voting on? There were still huge numbers who were still saying the top ones are economy, healthcare, COVID, economy, healthcare, COVID. And so in any one of these things, it's the silver bullet problem, that people think that you can just do the paper towels and it's a shortcut to be able to not have to do any of the rest. No, the paper towels helps you cross this threshold question of, saying he's not with us. We're going to be with you. But then you have to prove that you're with you, right? We're going to prove it on the things that you actually are listening to and caring about. And again, I think it's worth repeating when it comes to Latino vote. Vast majorities rejected Donald Trump. Vast majorities.
Yes, of course.
So we are talking about like small slivers, but the small slivers matter.
Significant slivers, yeah.
And you see it in the polling, you see it in focus groups. The number of people in focus groups will tell you, oh, he's a racist. Oh, he does not like Hispanics. I hate everything he says. I actually don't like him very much. But I trust him more on the economy. And it's like this stubborn belief in Donald Trump as better on the economy because he's a businessman. And ultimately saying, I'm going to vote on that. And it's especially, I would say, like younger men, among whom there's lower social trust, lower belief that elections are going to change anything very much in their lives anyway. So I'm just going to go with the person who maybe is going to create more opportunity broadly. And it's a cynical approach, but Donald Trump was speaking to it.
I hear you.
Yeah.
I'll
also say, I also think I'll try to answer the humanity piece. A lot of Latinos, we are, whether you're first generation or second generation, you already feel some kind of privilege because you are here, right? You are better off, for a lot of us. You're better off than your country, than your family is back home. So you already feel a certain degree of privilege, right? That's the first thing. And I always joke that we also have really thick skin. Like, you know, it's very hard for anyone on the outside to tell me something about myself that my family already hasn't told me. I know my flaws, you know, they let me know. And I say that because I kind of translate that when it comes to politics, right? We really do look at, to Carlos's point, the economy. They're like, yeah, you know, they're trying to offend me, but I'm not going to pay attention to that. I came here to work hard. I came here to work hard and to improve my family. Who's going to help me do that? And so it does always come back to this jobs, economy, pull yourself up by your bootstraps argument. And I do think that the Latino community who did vote for Trump was able to turn away the humanity piece, because oftentimes they've had to turn away from that in so many other places in their lives. And so it's not about that. That's not the reason why we're here. We're here to, you know, for a better life. And, you know, I think that's what it is at the end of the day.
Yeah, no. And again, I think what is also true is that the community probably interfaces with the question of humanity very differently than how Black people in America interface with the question of humanity, because the disrespect isn't the tossing of towels. It is, will my kid make it home tonight? And that is primal. That is Maslow's hierarchy of needs of safety, security, even before food and shelter. You all have been extremely illuminating during this conversation around setting the table, I think, on this conversation and putting into proper perspective that this isn't a blame game conversation for any specific constituency within our democracy. For me, the urgency here is that I don't like the trend lines. I don't like the direction it appears we're going in the state of Florida. I am terrified that already too many national Democrats have already decided that there is a blue wall and a pathway to the presidency that does not include Florida. And I think that is dangerous, because maybe that might be true for the presidency, but it isn't true for the United States Senate, who have presented themselves as co-presidents, and in many cases trumping the presidency in the case of Supreme Court appointments for Obama, and the difference of what happened during Trump. It is also not true when it comes to, I think, our ability to win in statewide races. We saw the toll that was taken down ballot. There were not much coattails to speak of. They got the real consequences of some of these messages that were resonant statewide that took out a lot of good people. I mean, the wreckage on the field really sucks. And if we're going to be serious in Florida, because I think the value set is so similar, Latinos in Florida and their conservative principles and values are very similar to a lot of Black folks in the state of Florida when it comes to their religious beliefs and their value system, yet the performance is very different electorally. And so there's just real hard work that has to happen, that cannot happen 3 weeks out from the election. Fernand, I read some of your comments around, and this was brave of you as a consultant to the campaign, having produced a lot of Biden ads, basically saying, I should have been able to do this 6 months ago and not 6 weeks out from the election. And in a campaign that was as well resourced, the best resourced Democratic campaign in the history of presidential politics, money was not our problem. Intention, deliberation, and deliberateness, valuing folks beyond demography being destiny, and saying these are votes we have to go after, we have to earn if we're going to get. As I mentioned before, this was just the opening of this conversation, because I think it is one that we got to drill down. And I hope that you all will be open to visiting with us again, because I think a lot of people want to know what is going to be the salve, what's the balm in Florida, and for the Democratic future in Florida. And aside from a lot of work to do, y'all, we got to get really, really specific about those action steps and then start to fund them and execute them. For all our listeners, we're going to come back to you. This will be a longer podcast than we normally do because you're going to hear from the voices of some of the groups who are working on the ground, doing some of the door-to-door work to some extent, but also being very honest with us about strategic decisions that were made in the era of COVID that took a lot of our folks off of doorsteps when the Trump campaign, trucked it through, acted like the disease didn't exist, put a lot of people's lives at risk, but they may have been the benefactors of their work and their labor. And then we're going to hear from some of the electeds who fought these messaging battles, fought these tactical battles, and real time on the ground. We'll hear their assessments. We'll hear their recommendations about a way forward. And hopefully there'll be some people on the listening side who can help do something about it. This has again been another episode of Real Talk with Andrew Gillum. I want to thank again our amazing panel, brilliant experts who are on the field doing the work. And I'm looking forward to continuing to unpack this really important topic to the state of Florida, but also to the nation. Thank you all.